Hey you guys, this is Professor Smitherman Brown. I am coming to you today with some notes for Chapter 10. So just as a quick reminder, each week I will post the slides individually in case you prefer to kind of work through these on your own. And of course you should have your textbook, the Sayer text, that you can use as a guide as well. But if you prefer to listen to my notes, I will post these to YouTube and then link them on our Canvas site. And they'll be available for you as well. Do keep in mind, however, that the slides are pretty lengthy for each chapter. I think this one has like 64 slides, and so these recordings can get pretty long. I'm not going to cover everything in the slide presentation. Instead, I'll just kind of hit the highlights and then refer you to some other things that you need to make sure that you're checking into and reading over on your own. So in particular, I'll be walking you through a lot of the visual stuff that it's helpful to kind of see in person. So with that being said, we'll begin with Chapter 10. And Chapter 10 covers a lot of information. So we begin with the Counter-Reformation, and we're going to move through the Baroque period, but the Baroque period is kind of split up into 3 different subsets. So there's a lot of stuff here. Again, this could be a pretty long recording. I'll dump it all to YouTube, and you can kind of listen to it in chunks, fast forward where you need to, listen to it in small segments, and just pause and come back to it later. So remember that for each one of the chapters, I will include these learning goals. They're featured in the PowerPoints. They're also referenced in Canvas at the beginning of each module with a checklist. And they're also included at the beginning of each chapter in the textbook. So that's a really good idea just to kind of glance through these after you've finished reading each chapter, just to make sure that you know these main points. And if you can kind of get through each one of the learning goals here, you should be in pretty good shape for the first unit exam. So we're going to begin by talking about the Counter-Reformation and the artistic style that's associated with it, which is Mannerism. So to sort of set the scene for where we are, the Counter-Reformation is a response to one of the last events that occurs in the first humanities course. So this wraps up with Chapter 8 in the Sayer text. So if you're interested in refreshing your memory, or perhaps you're taking this course before you've had Humanities 1 with writing, then you may want to go back and skim through Chapter 8. But in that chapter, one of the major things that happens is the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation, just as a quick overview, is when you begin to have figures like Henry VIII in England and Martin Luther in Germany begin to question the power and the authority of the Roman Catholic Church in Italy. So what happens with that is there begins to be a whole Protestant Reformation and the beginning of Protestant religions. And so we know Protestant religions today in a number of different sects. They later split even further. So today we might have Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians, and all of these are various splinters of this Protestant faith. So after the Protestant Reformation, the church launches their own reformation, which is called the Counter-Reformation. And it's the church trying to counteract what's happened during this previous movement and really try to pull people back into the faith. So in 1545, they convene a Council of Trent. And this is convened by the Pope at the time, who's Pope Paul III. And they pull together this council of major figures from within the church, and they're seeking to reform the church following the Protestant Reformation. So some of the problems that Martin Luther launches against the church that sort of kicks off the Protestant Reformation, you might recall his 95 Theses, which he nails to the door of the Wittenberg Church in Germany. The 95 Theses is basically like a list of 95 rants he has against the church. Some of these included the selling of church offices and the selling of indulgences. And indulgences were sort of these get-out-of-jail-free cards. They lessened one's time spent in purgatory. Also, there was a widespread selling of church offices. So if you wanted to be a cardinal, if you wanted to be an upper official, you needed to have a fair amount of money to grease someone's palm with. So The Council of Trent comes out with a list of rules, including stopping the selling of indulgences and church offices. Sorry, not indulgences. They're going to keep indulgences, but stopping the selling of church offices and goods. Bishops were expelled from Rome. So Rome during the Protestant Reformation has been rebuilt, and it is this wonderful, lavish place. St. Peter's in the Vatican Church is beyond beautiful, filled with lots of treasures. So all of the bishops like to kind of hang out in Rome. But after the Council of Trent, they're dispelled, they're sent back to their local areas that they're supposed to be overseeing, and they're told not to live lavishly. The Council of Trent makes the decision that there's not going to be any kind of military action as the Catholic Church launched during the Crusades in the Middle Ages, but instead they're going to embark on a mission to win back the hearts and souls of folks who had strayed during the Protestant Reformation. The Council of Trent also confirms some doctrine that had been controversial and had been part of the 95 Theses of Martin Luther. And that includes the idea that one can get to heaven through good works. Martin Luther says by faith alone. And so there's this long-standing battle of whether it's good enough to just be a good person, or does one need to have faith in all of the doctrines of the church in order to get to heaven. Martin Luther says yes. The Catholic Church says good works can get you there as well. Transubstantiation, this is the idea that the Eucharist, or we more commonly call it the communion, the taking of wine and bread as a symbol for the body and blood of Christ in the Last Supper. Transubstantiation is the idea that the wine and bread literally are transformed into the body and blood of Christ instead of just symbolically. So that had been controversial for quite some time. The Council of Trent confirms that. Clerical celibacy, Martin Luther says that monks and church officials and cardinals and even the Pope should be allowed to marry, to have children, and we know that the Catholic Church confirms that they should remain celibate, and it remains as such today. They confirm the reality of purgatory. So often in the Protestant faith, we hear about heaven and hell. We don't spend a whole lot of time talking about purgatory. In the Catholic Church, there is this middle ground called purgatory, which is sort of like this vestibule or waiting area before the final decision for eternity is made. The Catholic Church believes in the veneration of saints and relics. So there's holy people, holy items within the church. And then, of course, the selling of indulgences. These get out of jail free cards where people can pay enough money and have their time in purgatory lessened. And of course, this means that this is a perk that's available to rich people and not so much to the poor and common people. So that's the scene. In the arts, there's a realization that the arts are very, very powerful in convincing people of what to believe and think. And that remains true today. A lot of what we believe, a lot of our value system, we get in large part from visual culture. We might get it from books that we read. We might get it from music that we listen to, art that we see, television programs that we watch. So it's always been this way. The arts have always had a lot of power in helping people to understand what's happening and understand a lot of symbolic things in particular. So within the Council of Trent, there's this little subgroup that works on how art should depict subjects. And what they call for is art that will deal with subjects directly and shy away from anything that might be deemed sensuous or physical or material. And that included everything from having light effects in painting to soft sensual brushwork in painting to the subject itself. Likewise, any form of music in the liturgy was meant to serve the text, and so the text should be clear and intelligible to the congregation, and so the music should allow the text to shine through. So the words being spoken should be more clear and more understandable than the music that accompanies the words. A good example of music that achieves this edict from the Council of Trent is this Mass for Pope Marcellus by Palestrina. So this is a piece that's referenced in the textbook, and you can find this readily available online if you want to take a listen to that and get a good idea of what it's like to hear music that focus on the words in the text more so than the music and the harmony. So the Holy Roman Empire is all of this area that we can see that's sort of this darker brown color. So this is the empire. These are the domains of Charles V, because Charles V is not only the Holy Roman Emperor, he also has ties in Spain. So we have this over here. But the boundaries of the empire are this section that's within the red lines here. So a really, really large section of Western Europe falls within the boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire, but then Charles V, who is the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, also has control in lots of other territories. So he's going to be one of the key players in the Counter-Reformation. So this is a really interesting piece that we're going to come back to, and it's a piece on Mannerism. But we're going to come back to it because it's not typical of what is happening during the Baroque period. Mannerism really is what evolves out of the Council of Trent, even though much of it is not in keeping with the Council of Trent. So Mannerism gets influenced by Michelangelo, and Michelangelo has a sort of history of being a kind of bad boy of painting. He's a sculptor. He's famous for the David. He is also famous for the Sistine ceiling, but he very famously does not enjoy painting. And so we're going to look at one of his works that is in this Mannerist style, and it's a very exaggerated style. It's a very unsettling style, and in a lot of ways, it goes against everything that the Council of Trent is putting forth. So the characteristics that we're going to see from this style: distorted artificial poses, mysterious or obscure settings, elongated proportions, and serpentine figures with no predominant view. And I'll explain what that means as we go forward. So here's one example of a version of Michelangelo's Pietà. Now, Michelangelo does a version of the Pietà in the Italian Renaissance that doesn't look anything like this. So first, just the topic, the subject of a Pietà. A Pietà, it translates to the pity, and what this is, and what his, if you want to just do a Google search of the Pietà, Michelangelo, you're going to come up with his much more famous version of it, which features the Virgin Mary cradling the Christ child after he's been taken down off of the cross. So the pity, or Pietà, refers to the pity of the Virgin Mary, this feeling of pity that we might have for this woman whose son is selected as a savior and gives his life, but also it calls attention to this motherly role that she has, that this is not just the Virgin Mary, but this is a mother who's lost her son. So that's the reference of the Pietà. This one is in the Mannerist style, and we have the Virgin Mary right over here to the side. And so you can check out in the book gives a really good explanation of all of the figures here, but I just want to spend some time talking about the exaggerated style, because this is what Mannerism is going to be associated with. So this is this really strong S curve that the body of Christ is making, is this serpentine kind of figure here. What this means is that all of this grouping taken together invites the viewer to have to walk around to see all of the pieces of the sculpture. So you can't just stand in front of this and take in everything that you need to know. That was the case with Michelangelo's earlier Pietà, but with this one, you've got the body that's open to one side of the composition, the face is open to this angle, and so really to understand everything that's happening and to see all of the figures as they're supporting Christ, you have to really kind of walk around and engage with the sculpture. So this is what it means by not having a predominant viewpoint. You can't stand right in front of this and understand everything that's going on. So it invites you to interact with it. That's important because the Baroque style is going to pick that up. This idea of having the viewer interact with the sculpture, have to walk around and understand some things from various viewpoints. This, however, is what Michelangelo is best known for when it comes to the Mannerist style. This is also in the Sistine Chapel. And the Sistine Chapel, by the way, is located at the Vatican. So it's a architectural structure of the Roman Catholic Church. This is the area where cardinals meet, and in particular, it's most famous for being the room in which cardinals meet when they're electing a new pope. So this is if you were to go and see this, this is the final wall. As you are exiting the Sistine Chapel, this would be the final thing that you saw before you exited as a tourist. This is called the Final Judgment. It's in the Mannerist style. And what this features is a judgment scene. So some things that are very common in judgment scenes, just very quickly, a figure of Christ here in the center. And flanked on Christ's side is the Virgin Mary. So the Mother Mary is featured with him. And he has one hand that is raised up towards the sky, you can see here. So this is this gesture of judgment, really. So he's encountering all of these masses of people who are lining up to get their judgment, and some are being cast downwards, others are being cast upwards. So downwards, they're met here. We have this opening to the mouth of hell down below. We have this really sort of a pagan reference to this ancient boat driver who would take you down into the depths of hell. So there's a lot of Greek and Roman mythology that's tied up in this as well. But you can see the damned souls down here in the lower right, and the souls that are ascending up into heaven on the upper left. So this is a judgment scene. There were some major problems with the composition. One was the excessive nudity at a time that the Council of Trent had just come out and said there needs to not be anything sensuous about a painting. And Michelangelo is known for all of his nude figures, both on the ceiling and in this composition. So what happens is a group of people are hired to come and paint breeches on, or these little sheets here on top of figures who would otherwise have been nude. So the painting gets altered quite a bit, and in the 1990s when this was restored, the decision was made to leave those additions because they were part of the church's history. And so these painters who had painted over this massive work by Michelangelo, their work remains there even still today. So some interesting things about this piece. This is thought to be an image of Saint Bartholomew, who was a saint in the church who was skinned alive as part of his punishment. So he's a church martyr. And interestingly, most art historians agree that this has the likeness of Michelangelo himself. So some think that Michelangelo painted himself as a self-portrait of St. Bartholomew and sort of suggested, and remember he doesn't really like painting very much, but sort of suggests that painting all of this vast room in the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling, and now this final wall makes him feel as though he's being skinned alive. You also get a nice close-up here of the very muscular figure of Christ and then the Virgin Mary who's off to his side. So these are religious topics, but they're not the kind of scenes that would have been sanctioned by the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent actually has a lot of problems with stuff like this, which takes us back to, I'm going in the wrong direction, takes us back to this earlier image here. This is still in the Mannerist style because it comes within the same period, and this is what many artists begin to play around with. So this painting is one of four. This is summer, and there's four of them. Each one of them depicts each one of the seasons. And this is a painting that shows all of the crops and all of the foods that would be available in each one of the seasons. And they're very creatively put together to make the profile of a person. So whenever artists were worried about the Council of Trent and they're worried about the type of images that would be okayed to depict for the church, they simply began to take commissions for non-religious works of art. So this is actually done for a royal family And it's done to suggest that there's lots of abundance in summertime. These are all of the foods that you can have. So you've got things like a pear for the chin, a peach here, an eggplant, a stalk of corn, that there's plenty and abundance within the crops and within the field. So this is a really interesting piece that comes out, and you can Google search this and see all 4 of these. But it really comes out as a kind of reaction to not really knowing how to cooperate with the Council of Trent and their edict on art. So to go back then, here are some additional works that come out during the period that are also Mannerist and are also not church scenes. So this is a piece that is about this story from Roman mythology, where Jupiter is the Roman version of Zeus in Greece. So Jupiter is like the king of the gods, and he's known for seducing women. Even though he's married to the goddess Hera, and she's a very jealous person, he's known for, and she's known as Juno, in the Roman period. So in the Greek period, they're known as Zeus and Hera. In the Roman period, because the Romans just kind of repitch all of the old Greek mythology stories, they're known as Jupiter and Juno. So Juno's very jealous of Jupiter. Jupiter is always going after other women. And this is exactly what this kind of painting depicts. So this would have been commissioned by a figure within the court. So again, we have royalty commissioning works, not necessarily the church. And this would have been held in a private gallery. So it's okay that it has more of a sensuous tone to it. And this is certainly a sensuous painting, not only in subject, but also in the loose brushwork that we see here. And Correggio is known for this kind of loose brushwork. So that would have been okay because it's not within the church setting. The story of Jupiter and Io, or Io, you'll hear it pronounced both ways. She is a beautiful milk maiden. She's out one day taking animals to get water from a river when she is spotted from Jupiter, or spotted by Jupiter. So Jupiter wants to go and meet this young woman and seduce her, but Hera has just, or Juno has just got really upset with him about doing this kind of thing, and so he needs to disguise himself. So he disguises himself as a cloud, covers the landscape up so that Juno or Hera can't see from where she sits on her perch up in the Godlands. So here Jupiter comes to Io as a cloud. You can barely make out this creepy face right here, kissing her, embracing her, and this cloud hand that comes around. So that's the story here that's being depicted. Likewise, we have something very similar with Titian, and with this one, this is a similar story with Jupiter, and you have the Rape of Europa. So this time he comes as a bull, and here she is being drug off by the bull, grabbing him by the horns, and the angels are sort of following her along her way. So sensuous again, not only in the subject matter, and you can see even that she's wearing a very thin nightgown, her breast is exposed here, but also in the brushstroke, the way that Titian in this case would apply paint to the canvas was in a really loose, sensuous kind of manner anyway. It's a very emotional application of paint. So this term mannerism is thought to refer to calling attention to the hand, calling attention to the fact that the artist's brushstroke is very apparent in the work. And then one of the final pieces of Mannerism, this is Madonna of the long neck. So now we're back to a religious subject, and this one is probably the most bizarre of any of the ones that we've seen. So again, we have this figure of the Madonna, this Mother Mary with the Christ child, who's a very elongated, unproportional figure here, and even the Mother Mary, very slender up top, this oval shaped face, which is also mimicked by this oval shaped vase right here, but a very large bottom, a very large lap here. You might even notice how her foot is overhanging the support as though it's kind of jutting out towards the viewer. So this kind of invites the viewer into the composition again. This is St. Jerome, and this was a commission where Parmigianino, the artist here, was given some pretty clear directions about what needed to be included in the composition. One of them was the figure of St. Jerome. And you can see here by the scale, this is a really odd space. So it seems as though this is a miniature St. Jerome, or perhaps this is supposed to suggest that he's so far back in the distance that he appears really small, but it's a very awkward, confusing space that's been created. And it's almost as though Parmigianino adds St. Jerome as a kind of afterthought. So other strange things about this style, this is a really distorted body, so extremely long leg here of this maiden. And then back to that vase again, she's not going to be able to sit this down. This doesn't have a bottom to it. It's going to tip right over. So a really weird spatial ambiguity, a really strange way of depicting the body. So this is Mannerism. Mannerism is pretty strange. It's very much out of context with the Council of Trent. And really, what we're going to see that reflects the Council of Trent and their edict is going to be the Baroque period. All right, so what happens then to these artists who are kind of painting out of line with what the Council of Trent has dictated? Well, this is a really good story of one artist who kind of gets in trouble for what he does. So this is the Feast in the House of Levi. This is by Paolo Veronese. The style is really Mannerist, although sometimes we just call it Counter-Reformation. I'll take either of those are fine. If you see this on an exam and you have to identify this style. So Pope Paul, remember, is the Pope who convenes that Council of Trent. Well, one of the things that he also does as a result of that council is put together a Roman Inquisition in 1542, actually right before the council, to just begin looking into evidence that there's heresy, or to really get a feel for what the arts are doing. So, this is a really good example of a painting that gets in trouble much later on. So Pope Paul initiates this Inquisition, which is just a kind of questioning of people about what it is that they're trying to do. And when he paints this about 30 years into the Inquisition, right away he gets called to answer some questions about this painting. The initial title of it was The Last Supper, and this was meant to be a Last Supper scene. You might think of Leonardo da Vinci's famous Last Supper, and you can kind of see along here in the background, we have certainly in the center this figure of Christ, and to the sides of him, some of his disciples along this very long table. So it's a Last Supper scene. One of the problems with it, however, is everything else that's going on in the composition, and that seems to be taking away from the Last Supper, which in church ideology is a really powerful moment, one of the last moments in the life of Christ. It's where they get the Eucharist from, this idea of the body and bread, and partaking in those in remembrance of Christ as the Savior figure. And yet Veronese has painted this moment amidst like the hustle and bustle of lots of things that are going on. So a few of those things, you've got animals, you've got this dog right up here in the front, you have court jesters over to the side, here's another court jester, you have lots of figures around the table, people serving, people laughing, people joking, people getting kind of pushy with one another, and all of this seems to be taking away from this very holy moment in the Last Supper. So Veronese gets questioned about this, and he says in his defense that he was given a commission to do the Last Supper, and he had a very large composition that he had to fill. And so he took some artistic license to fill it with lots of different figures and things that he felt like would have been true to the time period and to what a Last Supper actually would have been like. Well, the church and the Inquisition doesn't take kindly to this, and they give him 3 months to improve and correct the painting. he doesn't really feel like going back and changing anything, and so he very simply changes the name. So notice that the name is Feast in the House of Levi. This is no longer a Last Supper portrait. Instead, it's a portrait of another feast in a different location, but not the Last Supper. And so this allows him to kind of get away with this sort of composition. So El Greco, the works by El Greco, I'm not going to go through this because we need to kind of get along to the Baroque style, but I do encourage you to look specifically at this painting right here in terms of the Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition in particular. So I want you to pay close attention to how he begins to unite this Counter-Reformation movement and Mannerism, and some of the elements that he puts together are going to lead us to the Baroque, but I'm going to go ahead and go there now. So we'll begin by talking about the Baroque in the church, and we're going to look at three different types of Baroque art. One is Baroque art that's commissioned by the Roman Catholic Church as part of their Counter-Reformation. The second is going to be secular Baroque art that we see in Northern Europe, and the third is going to be royal Baroque art that gets commissioned by kings in primarily France and Spain is what we're going to look at. So let's just set the scene here. So in Italy, you have Jesuits who group together and argue that the purpose of religious art needs to be to teach and inspire the faithful, and that it should be easy to understand. It needs to be realistic. And despite what the Council of Trent says about there not being any sensuality in works of art, that there actually should be something emotional that draws the viewer in. And these are going to become the characteristics of the Baroque style. The work of Bernini is really, really paramount to playing a major role in Baroque art. So we're going to look at Bernini's sculptural program for the Cornaro Chapel, and this really kind of gets to what it is that the Baroque style is trying to achieve. So this, again, is the style of the Counter-Reformation. This is going to be their attempt to pull viewers back in who had fled due to the Protestant Reformation. The term Baroque comes from this Portuguese term barroco, which means a large irregular pearl. And this was originally used as an insult. So if you think of a pearl, something that is beautiful, it's a jewel, we wear it all the time in jewelry. But in this case, barroco means a large irregular pearl. So it's something that's supposed to be beautiful, but it's a little overdone and a little bit wonky. And that's really what the Baroque style is about. So some characteristics here: really, really heavy ornamentation. There's going to be lots of decoration, lots of gold, lots of marble flooring, motifs on everything, really grand, huge sculptural displays, an attention to the emotional experience of art, dramatic contrast of light and dark in painting, diagonal, swirling, flowing images, and the sense of action, excitement, and sensuality. And this is very different from Mannerism, and it's different from the Italian Renaissance that came before. So here is the entire Cornaro Chapel. This is a private family chapel in the Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, and it was commissioned by the Cornaro family. So the Cornaro family would have commissioned this work. This is sort of what the church means by good deeds. So one of the ways that you can do a good deed is to commission the embellishment of one area of a church. So the larger church here is the Santa Maria della Vittoria, and the Cornaro Chapel is one small part of it. This family commissions Bernini to decorate the interior of the church and make it this really lavish space. So we're going to look more closely at the center sculpture here, which is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. But Bernini is responsible for designing this entire alcove here, which includes this really theatrical frieze and pediment up here, as well as these balcony seats. So you can see on both the left and the right of this primary sculpture here, you have this balcony that's built into the side to create this really theatrical moment. And he includes sculptures of the Cornaro family as being present and overlooking this miracle scene, which is the ecstasy of St. Teresa that we're going to look at. Bernini also likes to play around with light a lot, and so there's this little light back here, or a window back here, that shines light in, and he installs all of these gilded rods in the background so that when the light floods in, it creates this look as though the light is shining down on this miraculous moment. So let's take a look at that. We'll look at this one first. So this is a close-up of that center sculpture. This is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, commissioned by the Cornaro family, executed by this sculptor Bernini. And this is based on the story of this Spanish nun, Teresa of Avila. And the scene that's depicted here is detailed in her book called, or her manuscript called, The Visions. And so St. Teresa becomes a saint later in life, and one of the reasons why she's accepted as a saint is because she has a miracle that occurs in her life, and it deals very much with this vision she has of this angel that comes to her with this long arrow and pierces her in the heart and leaves her in this state of ecstasy. So you can see this is in the textbook, and it's also in the slides if you want to go through and look at this later, or just pause and read this really quick. This is just an excerpt that tells you basically what I just summarized for you. She has this vision of this angel coming to her, piercing her in the heart with this arrow, and leaving her in a state of ecstasy. So, whereas the Council of Trent said there shouldn't be anything sensual about works of art in the church, the Counter-Reformation art, the Baroque art here, really does sidestep that last point because they use sensuality as a way to pull the viewer in. So you can notice here by the expression on her face, this feeling of ecstasy is akin to a sort of like sensual, sexual ecstasy that she experiences here. And in this way, it pulls the viewer in emotionally to what's happening in the sculpture. So other characteristics of the Baroque that we might recognize here, we have this diagonal movement. So the compositions are kind of set up to where the angel and Teresa make this diagonal motion. Her body makes another diagonal motion. She is lifted up onto this cloud, and so there's this sense of movement in the cloud, movement in the drapes of the angel, the drapery of the angels. Also has a sense of movement to it. So it's a really dynamic sort of composition. So this is another work by Bernini. And this is a work of David. So David was a very popular subject in the Italian Renaissance. And if you took Humanities 1, you probably saw several versions of this. Donatello does a very famous version. Michelangelo does a very famous version. And in fact, I have them here for you. So this is Donatello's version. This is Michelangelo's version. This is the Baroque version that is Bernini's. So these earlier two are from the Italian Renaissance. Notice a few things here about them. One is a difference in the moment of time that's being depicted. Donatello's is after the moment. So, by the way, I should just mention in case everyone isn't up on the story of David. So this is a story from the Bible, a biblical story about David. And he's a hero in the Bible who defeats Goliath, who is this giant that is harassing his village, and no one will volunteer to go out and fight Goliath. And he, as a young boy, volunteers to go and do that. So in the story, they try to outfit him with armor before he goes out to face Goliath. None of the armor fits. It's all too big. And so he just goes out in whatever he has on. He's very often depicted nudity, but here in the Counter-Reformation in the Baroque period, again, we have this cloth because the church is a little squeamish about nudity. In the earlier Renaissance periods, we do have complete nudity, although Donatello has this little hat and the boots down below. So anyways, he goes out, he faces Goliath, he uses a slingshot to throw a stone, stun Goliath. Goliath falls to the ground, and then he uses this sword here in Donatello's version to behead the giant Goliath and defeat him. So Donatello's features the moment after. We have the head of Goliath down below, and we have a very small, effeminate version of David here standing proudly over the head of Goliath. In Michelangelo's version, we have depicted the moment before, and we have this very rational David who is sizing up his enemy, figuring out how he's about to approach the situation. He's definitely outmatched. He has the sling over his shoulder, a rock in his hand, and he's concentrating on what's going to happen and how he's going to approach this battle. In Bernini's version, in keeping with the Baroque style, we have a composition that is right in the middle of action. So there's action here, there is movement, we still have this strong diagonal composition here with the body. And again, we have this kind of serpentine figure that seems to be spinning and inviting the viewer to kind of rotate around, navigate around, engage with the sculpture so that they can fully understand all aspects of it. So, for example, if you were looking at this from this angle over here, you just see this side of the body, and you have to kind of work yourself around to this side to be able to see the sling and the rock that he has tucked behind his back. So again, we have a composition that involves the viewer, makes the viewer interact with it, and there's no one predominant viewpoint for it. Whereas these two, you can look at this straight on directly in front of the sculpture. That's the predominant viewpoint, and you can tell everything you need to know about the sculpture. This one's dynamic, it's swirling, it's in movement, and that's sort of what Bernini is known for here. All right, so moving right along then. In painting, we also see some techniques that are associated with this church Baroque style. And in particular, we look at the work of Caravaggio. So Caravaggio, and I'm not going to go through all of this, I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights here. Caravaggio is best known for his creation of tenebrism. And tenebrism is a really, really exaggerated form of light and darkness. So here's a great example of tenebrism at play in this painting that he does here. He has really dark sections of the composition juxtaposed to this bright divine light, the light of God that's shining in. This is the story of the calling of St. Matthew. So in this composition, you have this figure of Christ, and you can tell it's Christ because he has this really sliver of a halo above his head. Christ who comes into this restaurant or a den of thieves where these fellas are sitting and partaking of their meal for the day. And he comes in with his right-hand man, John the Baptist, who's typically seen in compositions with Christ. So the calling of St. Matthew is one of the disciples of Christ. Before he is called by Jesus, is a tax collector. And tax collectors during biblical times are right up there with the rest of Jesus's disciples, who are largely liars and thieves and murderers. In the next slide, we're going to look at one of the murderous disciples. So tax collectors have a really bad reputation, not really great guys. This, by the way, is Matthew here, the guy who the light is shining on and Jesus is pointing at, and he's kind of like pointing towards this guy because surely he doesn't mean he's being called, but in fact, this is thought to be St. Matthew. All right. Other things about this composition, they're in contemporary dress. So this is what people of the late 1500s, early 1600s would have been wearing. So again, this is a way to kind of draw the viewer in. Imagine, if you will, if an artist today made a painting of the Calling of St. Matthew's and everyone was wearing what you're wearing right now. This is a way to really make you identify with the figures in the painting. And in fact, this was the church's way of suggesting to viewers that remember that Jesus hung out with some unsavory type people, right? So the disciples were not pillars of the community by no means, but they were called by Christ. There's forgiveness in Christianity, and they were sent on their way with him and had a sort of conversion. Likewise, the church is suggesting to people that even though they may have strayed, they may have gone the route of the Protestant faith, they're always welcome back into the church, and they'll be able to repent because there are worse people who have been involved with the church. Similarly, we have the conversion of St. Paul. This is also by Caravaggio. I'll leave it to you to kind of look up all of the details and the stories here. I've already kind of walked you through one of Caravaggio's works. I'll just point out very quickly, St. Paul is another one of the disciples. He was Saul before he was Paul. And as Saul, he was known for persecuting, and when I say persecuting, I mean murdering Christians. And so he has his conversion one day as he's riding his horse on the road to Damascus, and out of nowhere comes this light that blinds him. He falls from his horse, and that's the moment that we have here. So as you're looking at this, notice foreshortening. This is a technique that the artists use. It really takes a lot of skill if you've ever tried to draw anything in your life. This really takes a lot of skill to make it seem as though something within this two-dimensional picture plane is coming out towards the viewer. This is also a really large composition, so when someone saw this in person, it's almost as though you're looking down on this body of St. Paul as he is experiencing his conversion. So think about this. Notice other elements of the Baroque, those characteristics of the Baroque style that you might be able to apply to this composition as well. This is just to kind of give you an idea of other sort of work that Caravaggio was doing. This is a combination of a still life, so he's focusing on painting everyday objects, fruit and wine, with a portrait. And this is a portrait of Bacchus. Bacchus is the Roman god of wine. In Greece, he's known as Dionysus. And so this is an entirely different kind of composition. It's not a Christian composition at all, so it's not commissioned by the church. This would have been just for fun or to practice his own skill. So next up, we have this very interesting figure, our first female artist for us to talk about, Artisia Gentileschi. She is what we call a Caravaggisti. So a Caravaggisti is an artist who paints in the manner of Caravaggio. So a lot of the characteristics that we just saw in Caravaggio's painting, we're going to see here with Gentileschi as well. So she sort of has a little bit of a biographical background that we should know about because it does arguably affect her artwork. When she's young, she is apprenticed to a local artist so she can learn to be an artist. She's raped by her art teacher, and her father sues the art teacher because he had promised to marry her in order to get out of trouble for raping her. He claims that they have a relationship and they're going to get married, and he doesn't follow through on that. He doesn't marry her. So the father sues him for ruining his daughter and not keeping his promise. The trial is an absolute humiliation to Gentileschi. Not only is she put on trial for her virtue and her sexuality, but to add insult to injury, her art teacher also testifies that she's not a promising artist. She'll never make it as an artist. She has zero skill. So this really has an impact on her life, and she's known for painting really strong female figures from the Bible. In particular, she's taken with the story of Judith and Holofernes. So this is a lesser known story, and I'll talk about it in the next slide, but just know that she's so taken with this subject that she paints 5 versions of it. The one we're going to look at, by the way, is the tamest of the 5. I would encourage you to take a look at some of the others that you can find online readily, because they get pretty graphic. So again, the one that we're going to look at is the tamest of the 5. Oh, and by the way, she not only loves to depict Judith, she also makes a self-portrait of herself as Judith. So if we have any question of whether she identifies with the figure of Judith, she absolutely does. She paints herself as Judith. So note her face. This is a self-portrait of Arcimboldo Gentileschi. And here is Arcimboldo Gentileschi as Judith. So here's the story, the quick version of the story. Judith is a biblical figure. She's a Hebrew woman. Her village is under attack by Assyrians. And this Assyrian general, Holofernes, is her target. So she and her maid servant devise this plan to sneak out of their village, sneak into the military camp of the Assyrians, and she's going to seduce the general Holofernes, and she's successful at seducing him. She goes to bed with him. He falls asleep. She cuts his head off and saves her people. So she's considered this heroine of the Hebrew faith. So Judith, of course, probably identifies with this because you have this strong woman committing this act of violence against this man who would have probably harmed her and lots of other people had she not. So we have in the composition that tenebrism again, the really dark areas of the composition juxtaposed with really bright lights. This is a light that's coming from outside of the tent. So in the composition, Judith and the maidservant make up this strong diagonal shape again. We're in this very tense moment. The maidservant is cleaning up and wrapping up the head of Holofernes and tucking it out of the way. And Judith here is putting her hand up, suggesting that she needs to keep quiet. Someone might be coming. And certainly we have this light that's flooding in, creating this really tense moment, but also creating a lot of texture and movement within the painting. Let's see. That's pretty good. Just notice little things as we're going through the paintings here about the way the artist uses light and shadow to create a lot of dimensional depth to the painting, as well as the way that the artist is able to convey a sense of texture. So can you imagine what each piece of fabric, for example, might feel like, what the hilt of the sword might feel like? The artist does a really great job of depicting various textures here. All right, this portion I'm going to skip over. I do encourage you to go back and look at this within the slides, and in particular, take a look at the links that I have here for each one of the works, and they should all be good working links. If not, just do a search for it. So there's 3 composers to know about from the Baroque era, and read that section in the textbook. Make sure you have some basic facts about what they're known for, what each of them is for. So you've got Giovanni Gabrieli, Claudio Monteverde, and then Antonio Vivaldi. You'll really like this one, and likely this is something that you've heard before. Okay, so moving on to the second phase of Baroque art, and that is secular Baroque. The term secular means not religious, so that's typically used as an antonym to religious. So secular means that it's concerned with other things beyond the realm of religion. So we're going to see fewer scenes from Bible stories in the secular Baroque, and there's a couple of reasons for why this happens. One, we're in a different location. So the Church Baroque takes place very much in Italy, around Rome, at the Vatican, commissioned by the Roman Catholic Church. The secular Baroque is sometimes referred to as Northern Baroque because it takes place in Amsterdam, in the northern part of Europe, around the Netherlands. So to sort of set the scene here, there's a lot of various things that are happening. One, the area that we're going to talk about is a part of a Protestant region. So they fall under the Dutch Reformed Church, and the Dutch Reformed Church has banned art from churches. And so artists begin to not paint commissions for the church, but for a wealthy middle class. So Amsterdam is a trade city. It's right on a port to the North Sea. And this middle class is emerging that uses art as a way to demonstrate their wealth. So they're not as showy as we might see in the Baroque, in the church Baroque context, but certainly art is used to reflect their interest. And what are these people interested in? They are largely interested in paintings that reflect the vernacular, scenes of everyday life. We see landscape paintings, we see still lifes, we see portraits, and we're also going to see a new type of subject called the genre scene, and we'll work through those. So what does this style look like? These are some good notes to jot down. Again, this is also known as the Northern Baroque style. The painting is sometimes referred to as Dutch vernacular. That term vernacular means everyday. So it's art, again, that reflects the actual time and place in which the people live. So characteristics, there's a lot of attention to detailed observation. This style emerges at the same time that the scientific method is being introduced, that the telescope is being refined, the microscope is being refined. People now understand that the sun is center of the universe and not the planet Earth. And so there's lots of advances in technology, in philosophy, and in science in general. And so there's a lot of detailed observation here. We're going to see portraits that combine domestic interior, so we'll see the inside of some houses, and also helps to capture the personality of the person who's being depicted. We'll talk about still lifes and landscapes, and remember that we're not going to be dealing much with church spaces because art has largely been banned from the Dutch Reformed Church. So here's an example of that. This is just a quick view of the interior of St. Bavo's Church at Haarlem. And you can just see very quickly right away that the interior doesn't have the mosaic floors. It doesn't have gold and paintings and sculptures everywhere. The walls are whitewashed. It's very simple. There's a simple chandelier and a simple reference to a coat of arms here on the side. Here is the kind of art that we would readily see from the secular Baroque period. And this is an example of a still life. So a still life is a type of painting where the artist is depicting objects, everyday objects that are just sort of laying around the house. Very often, artists will make these type of paintings as a way of perfecting their skill, right? And so very often they're focusing on things like texture. So notice here like the texture of the vase versus the texture of the flower petals and the leaves. And then they're also focusing on things like light and shadow. So you can see here the shadow on this side of the vase, the shadow that's cast by this floral arrangement, the light as it reflects off of this nautilus shell here. But this is also known as a vanitas painting. So it's not just a still life, it's a still life that has a moral message in it. So a vanitas painting is one that gives a reminder to the viewer about how fleeting life is. And we've got a lot of really subtle references to that here in this composition. So in this painting, this is by Godard, Northern Baroque style. It's flowers in a Wanli vase, and that's just the type of vase here. This Asian vase called a Wanli vase with a blue tit, and the blue tit is the name of this bird over here. So let's work through a few symbols. One, we have this beautiful arrangement of flowers. flowers and really anything in nature sort of represent a life and death cycle, right? So people are born and die in the same way that flowers bloom and wilt. And we have a combination of those things. So we have flowers that are beginning to open here, that are newly bloomed, and then we also have flowers that are wilting, that are beyond their prime. So this is a reminder that all things that are beautiful will also eventually turn yellow and begin to decay. This one has like some bug bites in it. So it's a reminder that beauty is not everything. There's also this fly here on this rotting tulip up at the top, and fly, of course, also further suggests decay, as does the blue tit, and you can see that the blue tit is ripping apart this butterfly. So the entire composition here is a lesson to us not to be overly concerned with our outward shell. And so here we have this nautilus shell where there is inside of it, there's a little crustacean that lives, and the shell is just the outside of it, right? So it's a warning for us not to be too concerned with our outward shell. The physical beauty is something that can wane, can wilt, can leave us. But instead, it's more important to think about making a good inner person, if you will. So this is what a Vanitas painting would do, provide this kind of moral lesson. This is just an overview of Amsterdam here. So Amsterdam is this port city, and you can see the large windmills that Amsterdam is known for, and this church here in the center of it. Here we have a landscape painting. So landscapes are also something that the Dutch are really interested in here. And so this is a view of Haarlem from the dunes of Overveen. And in particular, this area, and you can kind of see some of these windmills in the background that this area is known for. The area is a place where people are really, really proud of the landscape. And just to kind of take you back here to Amsterdam as an example of this, a lot of this region would have been underwater. And so the windmills serve to kind of pump water out of land that can then be repurposed and used for farmlands, for building, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of pride in the landscape because there is this idea that the people here have reclaimed their land from the sea in order to make a nice life on it. So we have here in the foreground crops, people working in the fields, these domestic houses here. And then in the background, rising up out of the landscape, is this Dutch Reformed church as kind of like this focal point in the landscape. So this is another type of subject that was really popular during the secular period. And then lastly, we have this genre scene. So a genre scene is a scene from everyday life, and very often these are also Vanitas paintings in that they have a moral lesson for us. And this one is chock full of fun details. I'll just work through a couple, but I encourage you to go back and take a look at this painting in particular and make sure that you can kind of work through all of the pieces. So this is by the artist Jan Stein. Jan Stein, by the way, is in a self-portrait right here in the painting. And we have lots and lots and lots of things to kind of work through. So first, in the background, we have this church spire that's coming up out of the background. So the church is always this kind of presence. We also have this group of very pious looking people with their head coverings, and this little girl with her head covering as well, who's talking to this little boy who's on the bar side. So yeah, they have babies in the bar. We've got this little boy in the background. Here's a small child here and a small child here as well. So Jan Steen, in addition to being the artist here of this painting, he also is a successful tavern owner, and this is a scene at his own tavern. So you've got kind of this railing in the back that makes this division between this outside world that's very pious, very conservative, associated with the church, and this inner world that is a little more raucous and joyous, and where everybody is partaking in drink and having a really good time. So notice all of the drink glasses here, there, and everywhere. We've got glasses, we've got jugs of wine, we have all kinds of things going on here. So in the center of the painting, and what lends the title to the painting, is this dancing couple here. The guy is depicted as a kind of buffoon. So he's really kind of sloppy dressed. His fly is undone. He looks like he's probably had a little too much to drink, and he's really excited about pulling her out on the dance floor. She's kind of withdrawing, pulling away from him. She doesn't seem as stoked about it. So we have this mixed match couple. But then there's lots of other symbols around. We have right beneath the woman broken eggs on the floor. Eggs probably being a symbol of fertility, and they're broken here. So this is like a nice subtle reminder that, you know, she might be getting on up in age, and perhaps she shouldn't be refusing suitors if she wants to be a mother one day. We also have this bucket of flowers that has been overturned. And again, just like with the still life, the suggestion here is that beauty is fleeting. So she's not going to be young and beautiful forever. And then we also have this shoe here of the baby that's been lost, and lost shoes. This is going to come up again in the course later on. I think the next chapter, in fact. Lost shoes sometimes indicate the loss of innocence. And so we've got the baby missing her shoe here. This suggestion that all of these things taken together would indicate that the moral is here for the woman, that perhaps if she wants to kind of be a mother, she wants to be a wife, that the clock is ticking, her beauty is fleeting, and she should take those things into consideration. It could have a totally different moral, though, where it's suggesting to her perhaps the exact opposite of that. And this is really sort of open to interpretation. So I'd love to know what you think about it. It could be suggesting instead that these things are happening, and so perhaps she shouldn't be wasting her time in an environment like this with a buffoon like this, and instead she should be looking for something with a little more substance, right? And not just give in to these pressures. So the next artist we're going to look at from this time period is one of the more famous ones, and that is Vermeer. So Vermeer is very much associated with the secular Baroque, but during his lifetime he wasn't particularly famous. In fact, he leaves his wife and children with a fair amount of debt. His works were rediscovered about 200 years later in the 1800s, but very few amount of his works survive. So there's something like 34 known and confirmed Vermeers in the world. Only 3 of them are dated. So he is the master of the domestic interior and scenes of middle-class life. So here we go. This is the domestic interior. What we have here is a portrait of a person, but a portrait of a person in their home with their surroundings. So imagine, if you will, if I asked you to post a picture of you in your favorite room of your house. We might be able to tell a lot about a person based on their surroundings, right? The possessions that they have, the things that they have in their home. I mean, that is in fact what we do in this class, is look at the stuff, the artifacts people possess, and figure out something about that person. So this is Girl with a Pearl Necklace, and we have this young girl here in her home. We have this diagonal kind of space here, again, in keeping with the Baroque style. But we have this natural light that floods in through the window here. So she is a young woman. She is trying on pearls and earrings and possibly even these furs. And notice that there's this urn on the table here, and it's often been suggested that perhaps she has inherited things from her mother who's passed away. So she is a young girl at the cusp of becoming a woman, and she's testing out how she looks in this fine clothing and this jewelry for the first time. So we get, and she's looking, by the way, in this little mirror that's up on the wall as she's testing this out. So we get a sense of her station in life. She's probably middle to upper middle class. We can see that her furnishings are refined. She has very fancy fabrics on the chairs, this brush set here, and of course in her own clothing and in the jewelry, we get a sense that she's pretty well to do. So probably from the merchant class that is commissioning works of art like this. All right, and the secular Baroque ends with Rembrandt. I'm going to leave this painting for you to look at. I'll just tell you a really quick story that this was originally called the Night Watch, and now it has this much longer title to it. Because it was so covered in dirt and grime for such a long time that all people could see were like these two figures right here, and everything else was kind of in the dark. So they thought it was a nighttime scene. Instead, it's an early morning scene, and it depicts the soldiers as they're getting ready to go off to battle, as they're leaving this town where they've stayed the night and they're going off to battle. So once it was restored and people cleaned it, they realized there were a whole lot more figures in the background. So read up on this one on your own. See if you can figure out in particular what's going on with this little girl back here. Why is she glowing? And why is Rembrandt known for his group portraits in particular? This is another one by Rembrandt, very similar here as well. We've got another group portrait, and this one's included in great detail in your textbook, so take a look at that. This one is Vermeer again. I'm going to skip this one. You can find the information in your textbook, but notice his similar setup here. He always sets up a scene where the window's on the left, the light is kind of streaming in from the window. We get to see some of the furnishings, and we also get to see a piano, and we get to see people within this area. So in this one, you have the music lesson where this woman is playing the clavichord. All right, in music for the secular Baroque, here we have the clavier, the clavichord. This is Johann Sebastian Bach, and he is the person who is most associated with the secular Baroque style. And again, you can get a clip of this YouTube video. This is for his well-tempered clavier, and read up more about him in the textbook. Okay, finally, we get to the third rendition of the Baroque here, and it's going to look pretty similar to what we saw in the Church Baroque, lots of ornamentation and detail, but instead of having works of art that are commissioned by the church, they're going to be commissioned by kings instead. So in particular, we're going to look at Louis XIV in France and Philip IV in Spain, and they are monarchs during the age of absolutism. So absolutism is this period where monarchs have absolute rule. So they make the rules, the people follow them. The people don't have a whole lot of say in what's going to go on. So this is the type of government that eventually is going to lead to a couple of revolutions in which people begin to say, we don't want to be bossed around by a monarch anymore. We want to start making some decisions for ourselves. And then we begin to see democratic republics emerge, like our own. We do begin to see in England at least, this constitutional monarchy where the monarch, the absolute monarch, is kind of limited in power by a constitution and a parliament. So this is kind of this halfway point of having still a monarch, but a monarch that is limited in power by a parliament that's made up of common people. So in terms of art, we're going to see royal patronage, what it looks like when kings commission works of art. And art is going to be used very much to convey power and grandeur. And we're going to see this right off the bat with Louis and the Palace of Versailles. So what are the characteristics here? They're very similar to the Baroque of the church. The only difference is that the subjects of paintings and sculptures are going to be the monarchs and monarch families, and they're going to be commissioned by members of court instead of being commissioned by the church and depicting biblical scenes. So here we have Louis XIV, King of France. This is by Rigaud. It's Royal Baroque as the style. By the way, on the exam, if you ever are asked, and you will be asked, to identify a work of art, what that would look like is that I would give you a slide and you should be able to tell me the title, the artist, and the style. And I've tried to include that on all of the slides for you. So make sure that you go back and look at the regular PowerPoint and can kind of parse that out. All right, so Louis is depicted here looking very regal. Again, notice how the artist is able to convey things like texture, like the velvet here in the robe. And he's also indicating quite a few things. So we see a little glimpse of the palace behind him. We see the crown and the scepter. He is the absolute monarch. We see the sword at his hip. So he's also a military figure as commander-in-chief. But Louis is also quite the dancer, quite the theatrical performer. And so he's also showing off his legs here and the shoes that he's designed himself that feature a little bit of a red heel. And so he's showing off his athleticism, his youthfulness, and of course, his interest in the arts and in dance. So here is a drawing of Louis in a theatrical performance that he is invited to participate in, and it is called The Sun King after Apollo. So this is Louis as the Sun King. In addition to that, Louis reigns from the mid 1600s to the early 1700s as the King of France. He's responsible for introducing formal etiquette at court, such as which fork should you eat your salad with. He has rules for lots and lots of things that are based on your status, how many doors get opened for you, all kinds of different things related to etiquette. He also uses art and architecture to convey his power and grandeur. So he rules during this age of absolutism, where you have these strong centralized monarchies that exert royal power over their dominion. So he constructs this palace known as the Palace of Versailles, and we're going to see some images of that, but he originally grows up at what is now the Louvre. So today the Louvre is one of the most premier museums in all of the world. It's located in Paris. It was previously the palace of the French monarchy. But when he is young, his father dies and he becomes heir to the throne. He has a regent, of course, until he comes of age. But when he's like 5 years old, the people of Paris want to see this new boy king who is now heir to the throne. And so they break into the Louvre, they break into his bedchamber, and they don't do anything to harm him. They just kind of break in to look at him. But this moment terrifies Louis so much that as soon as he has power to make decisions, he begins this elaborate construction program wherein he moves his residence out of the center of Paris, out of the Louvre, and into Versailles. Versailles is out in the countryside, and it becomes the seat of the royal family from then on. Other things Louis is responsible for, he establishes national academies in painting, sculpture, dance, music, and architecture. And really, he's responsible for setting the taste of all of Europe. He also encourages his courtiers to live beyond their means and to live at the palace. He has a centralized government that he rules from Versailles, and he has a large, well-paid army. And when you have a large army and you pay them well, they are going to be at your beck and call. So that's really beneficial to him. So here is a view of Versailles. This is the grand facade. And you can see, while it's not a very large building in height, this really gives you a great sense of just how widespread and ginormous Versailles is. So this is one of the many, many fountains that is located on the premises of Versailles. We've got this sculpture here. So every inch of the grounds here are decorated with gardens, with fountains, with sculptures, and all of that is a complement to the massive building behind. Here's an interior scene. So this is Palace of Versailles. This is just a hallway. So this is the Hall of Mirrors. And it gives you just a good idea of what the interior of this palace looks like. So this includes 20 paintings on the ceiling that represent the accomplishments of the French government and the reign of Louis. And then we also see lots of other things like these crystal chandeliers, golden candelabras, and notice how these windows that open up to the courtyard are mirrored by mirrors on the other side of the hallway that create this really light, open, airy space as you go through. But this is the kind of decoration that we see throughout Versailles. This is just a plan of the gardens, but you can see all of the gardens of Versailles are very meticulously planned and organized with all of the fountains, all of the shrubbery. It's like an older version of Disneyland where everything is just really, really detailed. So here's an example of that. The north flower bed, the topiaries, the carefully planned out hedges and flowers everywhere. Here's another one of these great fountains, and you can see more of this grand facade in the background. So Louis, as I've already mentioned, sets the taste for what people are going to like. And there's two artists in particular that become very famous during this period because they're two of Louis's favorites. One is Peter Paul Rubens, featured here, and the other one is Nicolas Poussin. So they're extremely different in their styles. And I'll show you some quick examples of the work of each one of them. But you should know the characteristics for each one. So Rubens is a painter who really is not a contemporary to Louis. He actually paints for Louis's grandmother, Marie de Medici. You might remember that Medici name from Italy. So she is betrothed to the King of France at the time, and she arrives from Italy. And so here is a composition that Rubens does of the arrival of Louis XIV's grandmother, Marie, as she arrives in France to marry the king. So Rubens is known for his loose brush stroke, and we see lots of hazy loose brush stroke throughout here, but he's also known for his really voluptuous fleshy figures, which we see down here in the sea nymphs down below. And these figures are known as Rubenesque figures because he's so much identified with this type of very fleshy, voluptuous woman in particular. So here you have Marie de Medici coming off the gangway. Read up on this painting here. Make sure that you understand why it is that we have these strange nymphs and Neptune down below, what all of these things suggest. So I've given you some following figures to be able to identify within the portrait. So you can read about this one in your textbook. This is another one by Rubens where he takes this genre painting idea of people in their everyday life, partying, having a good time, and combines it with this landscape in the background. And so here we just have a scene, and Rubens is kind of known for his excessiveness. We have this scene of merriment and enjoyment, people dancing, people drinking, people fighting, a mother breastfeeding her child, lovers embracing one another. There's like all sorts of range of human activity here happening in this outside party. And then over in the lower right hand corner, you kind of see like the leftovers from the party that went on the night before. So it seems as though it's this never-ending party out here in the landscape. Directly opposed to that is the other artist, Nicolas Poussin. So he is trained in like the classical Italian Renaissance style. So his paintings are very serious in nature. This one is called Et in Arcadia Ego, which is Latin which means roughly, translates roughly, I once was also in Arcadia. And Arcadia is like this place that's known sort of like a paradise. So you have these three shepherds, and the subtitle is The Shepherds of Arcadia. These three shepherds from Arcadia who are walking through the countryside, and they come across this tomb, and that inscription is inscribed on the tomb, and that's what they're trying to read here, Et in Arcadia ego. This is an example of memento mori, which is a Latin term that means remember death. And so this is a painting that would remind the viewer that the person who resides in this tomb, as his tombstone suggests, once was among the living, once was also living in Arcadia. And it's a reminder to the living that they will one day be dead, be part of the dead, and have their own tomb. So they have also evoked here, this is the muse of history who has her hand on this guy's back, and she's kind of coming in to explain to these people what Et in Arcadia ego means and who this person was. So they're gone, they've passed from the living, and only history knows the deeds of that person. This stuff you can read on your own. So this is about Louis' interest in the theater and in the arts. And I want to wrap up by talking about Velasquez. So Velasquez, shifting gears away from France and away from Louis, we'll talk a little bit about Philip IV in Spain, who hires Velasquez to be his court painter. So he's the only person who paints for Philip IV after he gets that honor, and he's best known for Las Meninas. We'll skip this one. Here's Las Meninas, or the Maids of Honor, and you might notice this little girl, she's on the cover of your textbook. So Diego Velasquez, this is his most famous work that he creates. This is an earlier work that's an interesting work just to kind of give you a different idea of the kind of work that he's doing. So again, working in pagan works, this is the drunkards, and so it's essentially a scene of Bacchus here in the center, surrounded by a bunch of contemporary figures who are partaking in the wine. But in any case, back to Las Meninas, this is from the Royal Baroque. So this is the daughter of Philip and his wife, and we can see Philip and his wife back here in this mirror. So they are roughly at the vantage point where we're looking in on this scene. And the little girl here is getting ready, we should suggest, or we could guess, for a portrait. And she's being accompanied by her two maids of honor. So the title here is a little strange because the title is The Maids of Honor, and that seems to suggest that it's about these two figures who are helping this little girl get ready for her official royal portrait. But what the whole scene is about is court life in general. So there's references to famous works of art on the walls, as though Velasquez is not only painting this scene, but he's also painting miniatures of other actual famous works of art here. And he's painting what this entire scene would be like. This, by the way, is a self-portrait of Velasquez. So he's painting a picture of him painting, this is the back of the canvas, another picture. So a really kind of complicated scene here. We have members of the church. Spain, by the way, is Catholic for a very long time, so they're still part of the Roman Catholic Church. So we have a nun and a monk featured here. And then we also have court jesters who are probably here, and a dog, who are here for the entertainment of the little girl to try to keep her calm, keep her happy as she is sitting for her portrait. So rather than just paint a portrait of the little girl, the princess of Philip IV, instead, you have a portrait of the little girl in her domestic interior, right? So her life at court, everything that's involved with the day-to-day developments of her life. So this was a scene that was really favored by the king and queen for not only capturing the likeness of their daughter, but also capturing the likeness of what life is like in their court. This guy, by the way, in the back door, he's known as a a key master, and he's framed here by this doorway. He would be the person to come around and make sure everyone is staying on task and staying on their agenda for the day. So that's it for chapter 10. We'll pick up next week with chapter 11. Be sure to kind of go back through the slides in their regular format. Check out the links to the songs that are posted within the presentation. And as always, write to me, send me an email if you have any questions on any of the material or anything else.